Today we're here for the last panel to focus on institutional perspectives, which I think is sort of intentionally broadly defined. And I think part of the question is even sort of questioning what is institutions maybe, and how can they be sort of reimagined for a post-colonial moment or a decolonial praxis. So today, just to quickly introduce our panel so I don't take up too much time, we have Rashid bin Shabib via Zoom. I think he's in Dubai. Yeah, in his library. Yeah, in Dubai. So Rashid from Dubai, along with his twin brother Ahmed, has been researching, exhibiting, and publishing research related to the Middle East and North Africa and identity for quite some time now. For over a decade, Rashid and his brother have published Brown Book magazine, a wonderful magazine focusing on the arts in the Middle East and Arab world, the North African world. Also focusing on MENA diaspora, Middle East, North African diaspora. Their publication recently also contributed to the UAE winning the Golden Lion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Was that 2021? So he was a big major contributor to the UAE winning the Golden Lion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Rashid and Ahmed have worked on exhibitions and collaborations with the Vitra Design Museum, the Muji Gallery, Bois Boucher, Lars Muller, and with Rizzoli. I should also add, disclosure, Rashid was recently my PhD student. He recently defended and passed his PhD viva, titled A Canonical History of Architectural Discourse Produced by Arab Architects Within a Post-Colonial Arab World, 1930 to 1980. Next, we have Ingrid Schroder, who does not need introduction, but director of the AA, for those who might not know, but also formerly assistant professor at Cambridge and former colleagues at Cambridge, who focused really on the history and theory of architecture and landscape. What I find interesting is she sort of bridges the kind of post-colonial Atlantic question, in a sense, with her work, right? So she edited a book titled African Modernism, The Architecture of Independence, Ghana, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Zambia, on Park Books, which came out in 2022 with Manuel Hertz, Hans Focketien, and Julia Jomrozic. And then also her PhD is on the history of landscape architecture in Washington, D.C. So this is also an area of interest, which obviously is inflected and informed by settler colonial histories, particularly to do with slavery. So we're very delighted to have her speak, particularly with institutional relevance as director here. And then finally, the event organizer wonderfully brought us all together. I'm very grateful for that. Golnar Tajdar, who's an architect, urban designer, and researcher who specializes in the history of architecture. She co-authored Maxime Sirou Architecture, published in 2022, in Hafazieh and Godard Poetry, correct? Published in 2016. In 2020, she moved from Iran to study in the MA of History of Architecture at Birkbeck University, and soon after began her career here as an archivist at the AA. Her primary task was cataloging the Keith Critchlow collection, but she later became focused on the photographic collection. Currently, Golnar is working on her next monograph on the Iranian architect Mohsen Frouhi, 1907 to 1983. So with that, I'll let the conversation begin. After all three speakers, we'll have questions and a dialogue. Average of 15 minutes, I say, but we'll be kind of loose. We have till 4:30, I think. So we'll start with Ingrid and then Golnar and Rashid, if that's okay with you.
Wonderful.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nick. You know that this comes out of many conversations we've had previously, and it was a tremendous pleasure when you came to me to suggest a symposium. And I have to preempt all of this by saying I am a generalist, and I come with more questions than answers today. I think that my prevailing interest in the topic has grown really over the past, well, maybe my entire life. I grew up in Washington, D.C., which is in many ways quite removed from the topics of today, but I was brought up by a South American father and an American mother, and understood what it was to feel a little out of place in the institutions I was brought up in, and then to come to the UK and to be forever foreign. I still feel I am, even though I've been here for 33, 35 years. I think that there's some interesting problems to bookend this, in that now that I'm sitting in this chair in an institution that has 900 students, 500 staff, if you can believe it. Our students come from 80 different countries around the world. It has pretty much always been the case. Out of this also, there was a pet interest that emerged when I was teaching in Zurich, and we did the work for the book on African modernism. At a moment when I approached Ed Bottoms, and the Königsberger archive had just arrived, it had not been catalogued, it was not really available. And in order to conduct the research for that book meant conversations, it meant digging through really Google satellite view to try and find projects, to find things that still existed, to look through the one or two books, the amazing kind of ArcNet resource, to begin to piece together a very incomplete picture of a period of architecture or architectural expression that coincided with the independence movements in these 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. What then came about is then when I arrived here, that catalogue had been catalogued, and suddenly you have a story of nearly 20 years of AA history in which people came to study from largely the global south to begin to understand what architecture was and to take it back to their countries of origin. This is in the heyday of modernism, of modernity, at a point where that was, I suppose, coincided with an attempt at a scientific understanding of creating a level of environmental sustainability, of climate responsiveness that could be perpetuated around this ring that was then called the kind of the tropical zone. And there's a lot to argue about in relation to the impetus and the influence that then had on this ring of these nations that occupied this, what was the kind of the tropical ring. And obviously this comes with a tremendous amount of difficulty. You know, the school is essentially responsible for perpetuating a view of modernity or modernism for 20 years that was then created a level of uniformity or an understanding of appropriateness within domestic space, a level of, I suppose, familiar monumentality when it comes to institutional space that perhaps we should be quite uncomfortable with. However, we've embarked on this project with the help of the Graham Foundation to catalogue and digitize the work of the students from that 20-year period. But more importantly, and I think this is very much in line with the interviews you had earlier today, reach out to those some 600 students who were part of that program and to understand where those ideas evolved and found a different voice. Because I think that this comes this question of what do we teach? So what is, I suppose, preoccupies me now is while we can perhaps question our role in, again, perpetuating modernity across the world through this particular course from the Department of Tropical Architecture, if we still have 600 or 900 students from 80 different countries, are we not still doing the same? What version of architecture are we teaching? Where does it go? Where does it come from? And what values does it represent? I don't have the answer for that. I don't know if anyone really does. It comes up regularly when it comes to say, what do we teach in first year? To what extent do we have a canon? To what extent do we have a core course? Whose architecture are we teaching and with what authority? A number of years ago when I was still in Cambridge, I had the opportunity to rewrite the first year course, which was a tremendous pleasure. And I took this as a chance to essentially frame the journey into modernity and out of it again as a journey also around the world, to understand that ideas that started in London or Moscow or New York then had very particular iterations as they began to evolve in places like Tokyo, in places like Baghdad, in places like Dakar. But then not long ago, I had a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation with Moise Moussafavi, who's one of my predecessors here at the AA. And he spoke about his book on Tokyo. And one of the audience members asked, why Tokyo? And he talked about when he was young and in the office of his father, and he'd have these Japanese architects visiting. Now, this is, again, a moment when there was a kind of perpetuation of people like of Kenzo Tange, ideas of the metabolists that were instrumental in the way in which places like Iran, Iraq, etc., were envisaging their nationhood. So how do these ideas start to correlate, and how do we teach them? This whole concept that there's a unifying set of knowledge, that there's a unifying set of styles that we can teach as a history of architecture, that then we can understand our students can learn something from that they can take into their own practice, is always going to be deeply problematic. So do we teach nothing? Do we teach a series of questions that enable them to find their own way? That's always been the way in which the AA has operated. It's an opportunity to navigate a curriculum that is vast, that can be quite unique. But what are the constituent elements of that, and how do we act responsibly within a kind of very, very complex societal and historical terrain? I think this kind of brings me to the sort of interesting question of where issues of culture, hybridity, language start to influence the way in which we learn. I think, Rashid, you and I had a very good conversation a long time ago, sort of mid-PhD, about this very topic. The idea that one can acquire some forms of knowledge through a language culture, through a national culture that is quite specific. And I think, what you learn that comes out of a French tradition, what you learn that comes out of an English tradition, how do these prevailing colonial influences start to inform ideas of structure, ideas of form-making, ideas of representation, and how do they collide in places like the Middle East and North Africa? And I think that was absolutely fascinating, the conversations we had, Rashid, and then subsequently some of the conversations we've also had. How do we move forward? I think that the way in which an institution operates has to also respond to the idea of what an institution is. At the time when the Department of Tropical Architecture was operating, institutions were quite strong formal entities. They had a core structure. They delivered a curriculum that was very much aligned to an idea of what a professional would be within a professional environment. I would say as long as I've been a student and then a tutor and then an academic, that question has been deeply fraught. There isn't a week that goes by that people aren't questioning what architecture is and what our validity and seriousness. Are we being taken seriously enough? Now, I suppose the question is, if we're supposed to have this kind of clear idea of a body of knowledge that is then operative within a professional environment, what should that be? That has very practical elements to it, and yet it puts aside that body of knowledge, that body of experience, that idea of a kind of complex cultural background that is supposed to inform all those professional decisions. I also remember at one point, when we had a RIBA visit up in Cambridge, where one of the validators said, so can you demonstrate how you teach all aspects of architecture? I was like, no, I can't. But that's maybe the question. So what do we pick and choose, and to what extent do we call ourselves an institution? And without throwing the whole thing up in the air, if the AA gives us the opportunity to bring those 900 students together and enable them to ask questions of themselves, ask questions of each other, then as an institution, what we are doing is essentially curating a conversation. We're enabling also those people to respond to one another, not just here, but in the future, as they move forward back out into the world. So ultimately, I think what interests me from an institutional perspective is the idea that the AA is more than a school, but is an ongoing community of people who are now often in their 80s or 90s. We had Kenneth Frampton in earlier this week, who is still very much attached to the school and wants to be here. So he's perhaps at the upper end of the spectrum of experience of a place like this, through to our foundation students. These are the people who they don't just shape cities, they don't just shape buildings, but they're in communication with one another. So the importance and the responsibility to teach something of value to those who will be changing the world in contested situations, as there are so many of, particularly now at the moment, is a very important and loaded question. I picked up on the last bit of your summing up, Taraj. I do think that there is a level of global awareness that is perhaps not acknowledged in the institutions, that is deeply embedded in the kind of the digital realm. We have means of communication and sharing knowledge that go beyond the structure of the institution, that we have no control over. So ultimately, what do we have control over? From bringing it back to this kind of context of a kind of post-colonial condition, perhaps we have an ability to understand the ambiguity and to embed that ambiguity within the structure of the way in which we teach. That may be a sort of a non-answer to a difficult question, but I'm fascinated today to be able to have the conversation, to ask the questions of all of you here, and particularly those at the table, to say, what could we be doing better? How do we understand an institution to operate in a way that doesn't simply follow a pattern that in its own senses is deeply colonial, in the way in which it creates structures, it anticipates a certain order, it has very particular outcomes in mind? How do we free ourselves from that without being ignorant of it? I think that there's an understanding of the structures that can constrain our creativity and can constrain particularly the debates that we have that are unhelpful. But we still have to sit in a room together. We have to collaborate with one another. We have to have an understanding of each other's differences, an understanding of each other's talents, an understanding of the things that we struggle with. I hope that this school still, and the open door that it has to things like the public program and to events like we have this afternoon, all day, are an opportunity for that. And that within this we can begin to question, yes, what is a canon? What is a core topic? What is professionalism? And then ultimately, to what extent are those values that are instilled here transferable to other parts of the world? I think that overall, some of the values that we thought were virtuous perhaps weren't. Some of the values that we thought were of value that created a level of social equity, of equal opportunity to other institutional spaces, of culture, of health, of education, imposed a view of the world that perhaps we need to reflect on. My question now is, how do we resist doing the same? How do we use the conversation now to inform what we do next? How do we avoid the mistakes of the past? So it's an open question thrown back at you. I hate to throw this directly at you, Connor, but you set the scene, so I'm delighted to be here. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.